You can't come to Vicksburg, Mississippi without experiencing the river. And my father once told me any day out on the water is better than a day anywhere else. And I have to say that is absolutely true today. So we're out enjoying the Mississippi River. Captain Bob is gracious enough to show us around a little bit and cruise and help us relax. But Kris, as relaxed as we are today, things were a little bit more tumultuous on the river in 1863.
Yeah, I remember you saying something along the lines of there's no bad day when you're out on a battlefield. And not only are you on a river, you're also on a battlefield here in Vicksburg, because this is right here where the Union Navy was going to try to help take the city of Vicksburg. You know, this in 1863, this water would be filled with Union boats, the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy is an integral part to our story in Vicksburg, and I think a lot of people forget about that. And they are going to hem in one side of Vicksburg, the bluffs off to our left, or my left, and they're going to pound the city from this side, while on the other side, the far side, will be the U.S. Army. So this is a true siege. We're completely surrounded here in May, June, and July of 1863.
Now, the Union Navy had tried to come up here earlier and had a little less success. So why are they more successful later in the war than earlier in the war?
First off, in May of 1862, the Union Navy decides to come up the Mississippi River in seagoing ships. So they're bringing up large draft vessels that will come up the Mississippi, and that's not exactly what the Mississippi is designed for. And what they've done is they've taken the city of New Orleans in April of 1862, which is about 234 miles downriver from us. And then they start making their way up towards Vicksburg and Port Hudson, two key points on the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi is that spine of the United States. It's 2,350 miles long. It's a huge water system, and this is going to be big for commerce in the Midwest. The Midwest farmers are going to help to send their goods down towards New Orleans and out to the world. Confederacy want to do the same thing with King Cotton. They'll do the same thing with human chattel slaves. And this is going to be big business out here. So we want to open this up. Up the river comes David Glasgow Farragut, the guy who says, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead in 1864. Well, him going full speed ahead with a bunch of sea boats that are meant to be out in the ocean doesn't go very well. And then you're coming up to a fixed fortified position here at Vicksburg. It was a very tough place to break apart. The bluffs here at Vicksburg make a defensible position, and then you have these ships coming up here, Confederates defending their homeland. They're not ready to give up the fight. And this is going to go on for the next, 14 or so months, that we're going to see the Union Navy come up and down this river. Now, we're in what we call the brown water. There are two different navies in the Civil War. If you remember back to, some of our viewers will remember Vietnam, we think of the Mekong Delta, and we think of fighting that will go on there with small boats, like what we're on. That's what you need in the brown water. In the brown water is that fresh water coming down the Missouri, the Ohio, the Mississippi, and you need a different style boat.
Now, is that because the water is shallower, because the streams are narrower?
Well, that's part of it. So it's narrower. You're going to have the Mississippi River, even though it seems to be a very deep river, on average it's only 9 to 12 feet deep, depending on where you are. Its deepest point is actually just south of New Orleans at 200 feet deep. So you have these strange depths that you'll have to deal with. So you need vessels that can deal with basically the mud of the Mississippi. This river is going to flood at times. You have anything that happens upriver will impact us downstream. So if you have a heavy rain or a heavy snow, that's going to go into these rivers, into these tributaries, and flow down into the central part of the United States. 40% of the U.S.'s watershed comes right through here, through the Mississippi. This is the big drainage system of the central U.S. from the Alleghenies and the Rockies. Anything in the middle goes right down the Mississippi.
So where we're at right now is actually where the Yazoo River Canal comes out and meets the Mississippi River. But this is a different configuration than the river ran in 1863.
Yeah, one of the problems you have in 1863 for the Federal Navy is DeSoto Point. The Mississippi River is not a straight river. It zigzags up and down its entire pathway. And just opposite of Vicksburg was DeSoto Point, and it was basically a big turn in the river. So this enabled the Confederates to pour fire onto the slow-moving Union ships, the Union Navy.
Because they had to slow down to make the turn.
Yeah, they'd have to slow down, make these turns, keep with the channel, but then the river changes course. Now, the Mississippi is a very very powerful river. So now what we deal with in 1876 is something that Ulysses S. Grant couldn't do, and that was basically chop the head off at DeSoto Point. He tried to build a canal over there to move boats across it just to bypass the guns of Vicksburg. Well, in 1876, there's a massive flood in April, and that is going to make Vicksburg essentially a landlocked city for the next 25 years. It'll take a major organizational effort from the Army Corps of Engineers to basically move the Yazoo River to come in front of Vicksburg. So now, as we enter into the Mississippi down here, this is not where the Union fleet would have been in 1863. They would have already been in the Mississippi, coming all the way down or coming all the way up.
Now, there's a difference between the Navy as we think of it today, out on the ocean, versus the Navy that's operating on the Mississippi River in 1863. What's the difference between the blue water and the brown water Navy?
So I want you to think about the blue water. You think about the Gulf Coast, you think of the Atlantic coast. Those are deep draft vessels that have to go across the Atlantic or eventually go across the Pacific with the U.S. Navy. The brown water is anything inland. Think about the muddy Mississippi River. That brown water equals shallower depths, and that means you're going to have to navigate more. You can go in a straight line right across the Atlantic if you wanted to. Here in the Mississippi, the Big Black River, if that was navigable, the Red River, other rivers that are famous from the American Civil War, you're going to have a shallower draft boat, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of bottom to it, so it won't scrape the bottom of this river. And that means you have to have a different design. So this brown water, which is basically the drainage system of the central United States and the Mississippi, means you need a different type of ship than you would need on the high seas.
Now in 1862, when the U.S. Navy tried to reduce Vicksburg and couldn't, the Confederates figured, hey, we've got control of this river. What was life like for the Confederacy on this river during that period before 1863?
Before May of 1863, the Confederates really only have control of about 150 miles of the Mississippi. The mouth of the Mississippi has been cut off at New Orleans. North of here, up at Cairo and Memphis, you are going to have Union-controlled cities up there and ports. So now you only really have a point between Port Hudson south of us and Vicksburg. So the Confederacy does have a lifeline across to Louisiana behind me, which is known as the Trans-Mississippi, which means across the Mississippi or beyond the Mississippi. And that's where you can get the sugar, the molasses, soldiers to come across the Mississippi River, go into the east of the Confederacy and help supply the Confederacy. So they do have this small stretch. They also have rail lines that run across here. So they really do have a key vital hold here on the Mississippi between Vicksburg and Port Hudson.
And so that's really why the Union has to capture this stretch of the river, because that's really what's keeping the Confederacy connected to all those supplies.
That's part of it, yes. So what we need to do is cut this off. Some people will say that this was the head of the nail that kept the Confederacy together. Others will say this is the key to the entire Civil War, coming down here to Vicksburg. But essentially what we need to do is slice the Confederacy in two, and to do that, the U.S. Navy has to control the Mississippi River. To do that, they need support of the U.S. Army, as well as a much larger fleet. Keep in mind, the U.S. Navy in 1861 had 90 warships. About half of them were seaworthy, or commissioned as we would call it, and not all of those are in American waters, and not all of those are ready to come into the Mississippi or other places. So we do what we do in every American war. We start from behind and we start throwing money at the problem. And what we do is we build the Navy as quickly as possible, and by 1865 we have more than 600 ships in the United States Navy. It's the largest in the world. It's the best in the world? Maybe, because what they will do is find any ship that's on the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, buy that ship and slap a cannon on it and a crew, and there you are. That's part of the U.S. Navy. They will build some other more improved ships, like we think of the ironclads or the timberclads, but they're going to do anything they can to build that U.S. Navy.
The Confederates basically have to improvise in that same sort of way, and I think about kind of the hodgepodge Navy they have on this river at the time.
Yeah, anything down here again that that will float and they can put a cannon on, that's going to become a ship. But they will build in this area the CSS Arkansas, which is an ironclad ram. And what that means is it has a pointed hull and it can go at full speed into the side of a ship. It also has something like 10 guns on it, and it has iron armor over top of it. So in 1862, when the U.S. Navy comes up this river, they're a little bit worried. They have to take on this warship. I call it the Bismarck of the Mississippi River for the Confederates. And for about 23 days, it menaces the U.S. Navy, and they focus on it. And the U.S. Navy will lose a number of ships trying to take out the Arkansas. Eventually, they're able to force its capitulation. Confederates will burn it like they do most of their ships as the Federal Navy comes into many ports. But for a while there, the U.S. Navy was really worried about this one Confederate ship, and anytime it took to the river, they would swarm it and try to take it out.
Now, you've mentioned ironclads and timberclads. I've also heard of cottonclads. What's that?
So we have a variety of ships. Don't think of just that Monitor versus Merrimack or the Virginia, where you have iron-sided ships. You also have what are called timberclads, and these are essentially steamships with paddle wheels on the side of them, side wheelers as we would call them, and their armor is timber. Then we have these ironclad, what we call city-class ships. There's 7 of them. They're named after cities like the Pittsburgh or the Cairo, and they have a very shallow draft, about 6 feet. They're 175 feet long. Have a crew of 175 men, so it's easy to remember. And then you're going to have cotton-clad ships, which is simply taking 500-pound bales of cotton, putting it on the sides of your ships, and that is what's going to help to protect you. And they're pretty thick, so they will give you some sense of protection. You do have to, think, do I want to go to war in a ship that's protected by cotton? Cotton's king here in the South. I'm not sure it's cotton's king on the U.S. Navy side.
It might be bulletproof, but it's not cannonball proof.
No, it is slightly fire retardant, which is good on a ship. So.
Now, I want to back up for just a second, because as we talked about the importance of the Mississippi, you used the phrase, it's the spine of the country. How does the Mississippi tie into the larger Union strategy early in the war that we know of as the Anaconda Plan?
So when we think about strangling the South, what we're going to do is create a large navy that is going to go down the east coast of the Atlantic coast, up into the Gulf of Mexico, and then we have to go up the Mississippi River and up the Ohio River. So the Mississippi is vital because we need to send supplies and men up and down this river if we can. Now, when we start to talk about ships at the time, most of them are not very fast. We're talking they can do about 6 knots, just over about 6 miles an hour, down this river. The rivers, depending on what time of year it is, how much rain we've had, it depends how fast it's moving. At its mouth, it's about 1.5 miles or 1.5 knots. Up in this area, if it was in 1863 and calm weather, it'd be about 3 knots. So maybe you could get up to 10 knots to come down this river. Coming back up the river, though, you might be able to do 1 or 2 knots. So if the Confederates control any side of the river, and even if you have a very protected ship, they could put obstructions in the river, and this slow-moving, essentially turtles, will make these Union vessels, these Federal vessels, targets, easy targets. And we will lose a number of them here in the Mississippi River.
Now that ties into kind of the final Union strategy for taking Vicksburg. Coming up river's really slow, but we can come down pretty fast.
Yeah.
How does that tie into the ultimate Union success here?
So to make a very long story short, the U.S. Navy comes up the river. That doesn't work. Then they're going to try to go down the river. The problem is if they send the ships down the river, they can't really come back up the river past the guns. So Ulysses S. Grant and David Dixon Porter, 2 very innovative officers, one in the U.S. Army, one in the U.S. Navy, they think alike. And in April of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant's tried a lot of things to take Vicksburg. Nothing seems to be working. So he tries to move a force down Louisiana side and march it downriver to a place eventually called Hard Times Landing, which is just a great name. Then he talks to his Navy counterpart, Porter, and says, I want you to run the guns of Vicksburg, and I also need you to take supplies to my men. So he is going to put together a flotilla of boats, Porter will. He's going to pack them full of men. He's going to put some of them with supplies. He's going to lash them together. He's going to bring extra coal. He'll put anything he can on these ships. And then on April 16th, he's going to run past the guns of Vicksburg.
So Kris, we've talked about Vicksburg as a transportation hub with river, roads, rails. We see all 3 behind us right now.
Yeah, I mean, Vicksburg is the key to the Deep South down here. And if you want to move goods and equipment across into Louisiana, down into Texas, that's what you have to do, is come here to Vicksburg to do that. And in fact, I mean, it draws a lot of the most famous people prior to the war and during the war. Mark Twain came up and down this river. You know, he was one of the most famous people who come down the Mississippi. And Mark Twain isn't his name. Mark Twain actually means 2 fathoms. So on the river boat, if you're coming up and down the river, you would take a pole, put it down, and you would scream Mark Twain. So that's where he gets his name from. It's not, you know, it's actually Samuel Clemens is his real name, but he calls him Mark Twain. Abraham Lincoln comes down here. This is where he has his real experience in the Deep South, and especially with slavery. He sees slavery for the first time, firsthand. And then we'll have Jefferson Davis, maybe 15, 20 miles downriver from where we are. He has his plantation at Briarfield. He's the Confederate president. He'll come through here during the war. We have others like John Pemberton, John Breckinridge, who seems to be everywhere during the Civil War, and many, many others. And then after the American Civil War, Presidents McKinley will be down here. Eisenhower comes here before he's president in the 40s. I mean, we have a lot of famous people who come through here, including Booker T. Washington.
So now you were telling me a second ago, David Dixon Porter loads up his fleet with as much stuff as he can, and he decides to run the batteries. And you said running the batteries means getting by them as fast as possible. What happened?
So what running the guns really means is we're going to take our ships as fast as we can around DeSoto Point, past the guns of Vicksburg, and then try to get down to Bruinsburg, which is about 30 miles to the south of us, which is essentially where Hard Times Landing will be. And when I say run the guns, it takes 2.5 hours to get past Vicksburg's guns. So on the evening of April 16th into the morning of the next day, you're going to start to see the greatest fireworks display along the Mississippi River, at least this part of the Mississippi River. And you will have Union guns firing into the city, and you'll have Confederate guns firing into the river. And amazingly, the Confederates will hit a number of the ships. They'll sink a coal barge, and they'll sink one other ship. But miraculously, almost the entire fleet makes it past the guns of Vicksburg, which is actually ironic because Ulysses S. Grant's good friend, William T. Sherman, is going to be sitting down around where we are with 4 rowboats and his staff because he thought it was going to be such a debacle that he's meant to be fishing sailors out of the river for the next day and a half. And amazingly, he does pull a few out of the river, but the Federal fleet makes it past. They get down to Hard Times Landing, and now Grant realizes, all right, we got something here. A few days later, on April 22nd, he's going to run transports down the river next. These are unarmed vessels who have to do the same thing as fast as they can, get past those guns of Vicksburg. The difference this time, though, is the Confederates don't have their heads down because there's no one firing back at them. So the pyrotechnics display is even larger. One man said that if they were on that ship that night, you could read a newspaper by the light of all the flares and the artillery shells blowing up above them. And they were passing Warren County Courthouse at 12:20 a.m. Man, this is one of the most unique ways to experience Vicksburg, and it's a way that most people don't get to come out here and see really a different angle of a battlefield. The cliffs and the bluffs of Vicksburg that they talk about so much on the Union Navy side, the mighty Mississippi out in front of us, the Yazoo behind us. This is just a great way to experience Vicksburg.
And you can experience it this way if you hire Captain Bob to take you out here. Bob, you're a fishing charter out here.
Exactly.
What's it like to be out on the river so much?
Oh, it's amazing. You guys were talking about what a unique experience it is. I get to do this every day.
Now, you bring people out here to go fishing.
Right.
Now, I'm sure you've got stories that I'm sure are all true as a fisherman.
Yeah.
What do you guys fish for out here?
We fish for catfish. And the Mississippi River has the largest catfish in North America.
How big are some of the catfish you pull out of here?
Oh, heck. The Mississippi state record is 131 pounds. And we've caught fish up to 90 pounds.
Wow.
So it's just an amazing resource. And people just don't experience it that much. Look out, you don't see anybody out here. It's just an amazing resource. It's just a shame it's not used more.
So you were talking a little earlier about the cooperation between Grant and Porter, and that's something that, you know, maybe in modern perspectives we tend to take that for granted. But the Army and the Navy weren't necessarily married in cooperation back then. How important was this Grant-Porter relationship?
I think it's key to the war, and it's not just with Porter. Grant is great working with the Navy. He sees the value of them at places like Fort Henry and Donelson. He sees it here on the Vicksburg, or He sees it here on the Mississippi as well. He knows that he has to work with the U.S. Navy. We call that today combined arms. We're going to work with one branch of service and then the other. And in fact, I say that the Vicksburg Campaign is the greatest combined arms effort of the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy until World War II. Some people might argue that we did some things in the Spanish-American War, but most of that was troop transport. Same with World War I. In World War II, we needed combined arms in the Pacific and the Atlantic. And down here, during the Vicksburg Campaign, this is exactly what men like Dwight D. Eisenhower, Mark Clark, Douglas MacArthur, they're learning about this campaign. And in fact, during Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield, during the first Iraq War, they had studied Grant's campaign down here, and that combined arms, making a feint in one place and then moving in another place. They're gonna work it to perfection.
Wow. Porter runs the batteries, he gets down, he links up with Grant. What's the fruit of all of that activity?
Well, the two runs, the not fun runs as you would call them today, down the river actually are going to set up the Union Navy and Army for success. So now we have the ability to move across the Mississippi. Now keep in mind, the Mississippi is a very wide river. Like about where we are is a little more than a half mile wide. You know, so what you need to do is get troop transports across the river. You also have to have security for your forces. So you now have gunboats down there, you have transports, you have troops that have marched down the Louisiana side. Now you have an equation for a campaign. They'll move across from hard times, go over to Bruinsburg, and they're going to start making their way northeast. And that is going to really initiate the fast-moving next 17 days of the Vicksburg Campaign.
And the Navy's not done either. They play a role in what happens next.
Yeah, the Navy actually comes back upriver, some of them, some come downriver, and they converge on Vicksburg because the Union Army is going to move inland and then out towards Jackson, Mississippi. That is the state capital, and then move back towards us. And now on the other side of the city of Vicksburg is the Union Navy. So during this 47-day siege, we're going to bombard the city from both sides. Unfortunately, the civilians are caught in the middle. When we think about bombarding the city, David Dixon Porter is going to tell some of his gunners at one point to aim for the Warren County Courthouse because that is a prominent feature of the Civil War era Vicksburg skyline. And that's what you're going to aim for, but that also means you're going to rain shells into the city. Amazingly, only 12 or so civilians are killed and about 24 or so are wounded during this 47-day siege, but many people move out into the hillsides, literally digging caves into the hillsides here in Vicksburg to tunnel into the earth to find protection.
Talk about the USS Cairo.
The USS Cairo is a ironclad ship. It's called a city-class ship, so it's named after Cairo, Illinois. It's one of the 7 city-class ships that are created. It is specifically designed to go into these rivers. So in December of 1862, the Federals decide we're going to try to go up the Yazoo River and, you know, maybe approach Vicksburg from a different point. Unfortunately, the Confederates had put mines in the river. We called them torpedoes at the time, and the Cairo is going to hit 2 of those mines and within just a few minutes sink to the bottom of the Mississippi. Amazingly, the mud of the Mississippi create basically a tomb for this ship. Nobody goes down with the ship. Actually, everybody survives, all 175 crew. But when the ship goes down, it settles in that mud, and that actually protects everything that's inside of it. So when it's located in the 1950s and then raised from the Mississippi's floor in 1964, it is a treasure trove of what we call material culture. If you think of artifacts, this thing had everything from the pocket watch on there to arms and ammunition to anything like bottles and foodstuffs. So the Cairo turned into a treasure trove and is now part of Vicksburg National Military Park.
My last question, and this ties into a question we started to answer earlier. You talked about the Brown Water Navy in an example that people today might remember. Kind of ties back to Vietnam and kind of the operation of the Brown Water Navy there. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think when people think of the Brown Water Navy, they can look back on Vietnam and in the campaigns along the Mekong Delta, where you have these very close quarters actions. And the Mississippi is a wide river, but we have other river actions that will take place, you know, up on the Cumberland River or on the Tennessee River, and we need specialized boats to go up and down these waterways. But you also have to remember that these waterways create choke points, and you can have land forces come in and try to assault these ships. And sometimes you'll have obstructions in the river. So we have a different type of warfare here on the rivers. So if we're going to go out to places like Fort Sumter or out down to Pensacola to Fort Pickens, we can bring in a large number of ships, or out to Fort Fisher, and we can bombard a point well off of shore, and we're basically protected by distance. Here on the Mississippi, if we're going to take places like Vicksburg, Fort Jackson, or go up to Forts Henry and Donaldson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, we are going to have a confined space, which means we only have X number of ships that we can put a line to bombard a point, and we have the potential for counterinsurgents to come out, put boats in the water, and maybe, you know, potentially try to take them from the rear or block your pathway down river. So it's a different type of naval warfare. Even though we're on the water, we have to have different tactics, we have to have different equipment, and we have to have different training. I think the one question that you haven't asked is, why should people see it from the water? Well, not only is it peaceful for the most part today, but it is a beautiful perspective. It gives us a completely different perspective of those sailors who are out here on the water, who are looking up at those bluffs. Man, it might have been a dominant feature in 1863. It still is a dominant feature today. Even though the Mississippi's changed its course, you still should come down the Mississippi, up the Yazoo, and check out Vicksburg from that different perspective. And it's a different way to appreciate history.
We're running out of daylight and we want to get off the river before it gets dark, because as Captain Bob says, it can get dangerous out here. It's been a wonderful time out on the river. Thanks for being out here with us. Let's head back to land.